I arrived at work to find my keycard deactivated and a termination letter on my desk. CEO Richard Brennan stood in the conference room with the entire compliance team, announcing I was non-essential overhead. I was escorted out carrying a cardboard box while he told everyone they were streamlining operations. As security walked me to my car, I saw him through the window, laughing with the board members. 24 hours later, 3 black SUVs pulled into the company parking lot, and federal agents walked straight into his office. The morning of my termination started like any other day at Titan Defense Solutions. I'd been senior compliance director for 5 years, managing classified government contracts worth $400 million annually. My top secret clearance wasn't just a credential, it was the cornerstone of our entire operation. I was the only person authorized to submit quarterly compliance reports to the Department of Defense, a responsibility I'd never taken lightly. 3 weeks before my termination, Richard had hired his nephew Brandon as Executive Vice President of Innovation. The title sounded impressive, until you realized Brandon's previous experience consisted of managing a failed food truck business and posting motivational quotes on social media. His salary was 3 times mine, a fact I discovered accidentally when payroll mistakenly sent me the executive compensation report. But Brandon's hiring wasn't what concerned me most. 2 months earlier, I'd noticed irregularities in our billing statements. Phantom employees appeared on government projects, people who supposedly worked full-time but whom nobody had ever met. Their salaries were being charged to the Department of Defense at premium contractor rates. When I brought this to Richard's attention, he brushed it off as an accounting error that would be corrected. The irregularities continued to pile up. Equipment purchases that never materialized, consulting fees paid to companies that didn't exist, travel expenses for trips that never happened. Each time I raised concerns, Richard grew more hostile. He called me paranoid, suggested I was overstepping my boundaries, implied that maybe I wasn't a team player. The morning before my termination, I'd made a decision that would change everything. After discovering that our latest quarterly report contained fabricated data about veteran hiring initiatives, I couldn't stay silent any longer. The government required us to maintain 30% veteran employment on certain contracts. Our actual number was 12%. But the report Richard wanted me to sign claimed 35%. I'd spent all night agonizing over what to do. My mortgage, my mother's medical bills, my entire life depended on this job. But I kept thinking about the veterans who weren't getting hired because Richard was lying about already employing them. I thought about the taxpayers funding phantom employees. I thought about my father, who'd served 22 years in the Navy and taught me that integrity wasn't negotiable. At 6 that morning, before anyone else arrived at the office, I'd sent a detailed report to the DoD Inspector General's office. I included spreadsheets, emails, and documentation of every discrepancy I'd found. What I didn't know then was that my report had triggered an automatic audit protocol. Once initiated, this process couldn't be stopped, not even by Richard's powerful connections. When I walked into the office at 8, Richard was already there, which was unusual since he typically didn't arrive until 10. He was standing by my desk with the head of security and someone from human resources. The termination letter was brief and cold. My position had been eliminated as part of a restructuring initiative. I was non-essential overhead, effective immediately. The security guard, Tom, whom I'd known for 5 years and whose daughter I'd helped get an internship, couldn't look me in the eye as he watched me pack my belongings. I wasn't allowed to access my computer or take any files. They even confiscated my company phone before I'd finished clearing my desk. As I carried my cardboard box through the office, my colleagues avoided eye contact. Some looked confused, others frightened. Mary from accounting started to approach me, but Richard's sharp voice stopped her. He announced to everyone that this was what happened to employees who couldn't adapt to the company's new direction. The walk to my car felt endless. Each step echoed in the parking garage, a soundtrack to my professional funeral. But as I placed the box in my trunk, I noticed something Richard hadn't considered. The compliance reports were due to the Department of Defense in 48 hours. Without my signature and my secure access credentials, those reports couldn't be submitted, and failure to submit them would trigger an immediate federal review. That evening, I sat in my apartment, staring at my personal phone as it buzzed with messages from former colleagues. Some offered condolences. Others wanted to know what had really happened. Maria, my former assistant, texted that Richard had held an all-hands meeting after I left, claiming they'd discovered serious issues with my work and that my termination was necessary to protect the company. 24 hours later, I was making coffee when my phone rang. It was Tom from security. His voice was shaking as he told me that 3 black SUVs had just pulled into the company parking lot. Federal agents with FBI and DOD credentials were walking through the front door. They went straight to Richard's office, and one agent, after slowly removing his glasses, had said something that made Richard's face turn white. Tom couldn't hear everything, but he caught fragments through the glass walls. Something about security clearances, classified information, and a woman whose authorization was critical to national security contracts. Richard's confident demeanor had crumbled in seconds, and now agents were boxing up files from his office while he sat there, no longer laughing. My phone started ringing at 7 the next morning. Richard's number appeared on the screen, and I let it go to voicemail. He called again immediately. Then again. By the 5th call, curiosity got the better of me. But I still didn't answer. Instead, I listened to the voicemails pile up, each one more frantic than the last. The first message maintained his CEO composure. Richard's voice was steady, professional, almost friendly. He said there had been a misunderstanding, that human resources had acted without his full knowledge, and that he wanted to discuss my immediate reinstatement. He mentioned a substantial raise and additional benefits, trying to sound generous rather than desperate. The second voicemail, left just 10 minutes later, dropped the pretense. He said the company needed me to return immediately to handle some urgent compliance matters. His tone suggested this was a reasonable request, as if I hadn't been escorted from the building like a criminal just 2 days earlier. He emphasized that this was time-sensitive and that the company would compensate me generously for any inconvenience. By the third message, the mask had completely slipped. Richard's voice was strained as he explained that federal investigators were asking for documents only I could provide. He insisted I had a contractual obligation to assist with the transition, conveniently forgetting that Head terminated that contract. He threatened legal action for abandoning critical duties, apparently unaware of the irony in accusing me of abandonment when Head literally thrown me out. The 4th and 5th messages were barely coherent. Richard alternated between threats and pleas, promising to destroy my career if I didn't respond while simultaneously offering to double my salary if I came back. He mentioned that the federal agents were asking specifically about me, wanting to know why the person responsible for compliance reporting had been terminated right before critical deadlines. I was sitting at my kitchen table, listening to these messages on speaker, when my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw a woman in a dark suit, holding FBI credentials. My heart raced as I opened the door, wondering if Richard had somehow managed to turn this situation against me. Special Agent Patricia Morgan introduced herself with a firm handshake and a slight smile that immediately put me at ease. She asked if we could talk, and I invited her in, my hands shaking slightly as I prepared coffee for both of us. Agent Morgan settled into my living room chair with the confidence of someone who'd done this hundreds of times before. She began by telling me that Titan Defense Solutions had been under surveillance for 6 months. The FBI and DOD had been tracking suspicious financial patterns and unauthorized access to classified systems. They'd been building a case, but they needed someone on the inside to break it open. My report to the Inspector General had provided the catalyst they'd been waiting for. What she told me next made my blood run cold. The investigation had revealed that someone at Titan Defense had been accessing classified project specifications using my credentials. The access logs showed activity at times when I was provably elsewhere, including during a week when I'd been visiting my mother in Florida. Someone had cloned my security credentials and had been using them to download information about submarine detection systems, next-generation radar technology, and drone countermeasures. Agent Morgan showed me photographs that made my stomach turn. Richard meeting with executives from Helix Corporation, our biggest competitor. Richard at a private dinner with representatives from a company known to have ties to foreign defense manufacturers. Richard exchanging USB drives in a hotel parking lot with someone the FBI had been tracking for industrial espionage. The agent explained that my termination had actually helped their case. By firing me, Richard had violated the Whistleblower Protection Act, making him personally liable for obstruction of justice. More importantly, without my active credentials, the illegal access had continued for 2 days after my termination, proving definitively that someone else was using my authorization. The digital trail led directly to Richard's executive assistant's computer, though they suspected he was the one actually conducting the searches. Agent Morgan then asked the question I'd been dreading: would I cooperate fully with the investigation? She was honest about what this meant. I would need to provide complete documentation of everything I'd observed. I would likely need to testify before a grand jury, and possibly in open court. Richard had resources and connections, and he would undoubtedly try to destroy my reputation to save himself. But then she said something that changed everything. Without my cooperation, there was a chance Richard could frame me as the source of the security breach. He had already started laying groundwork, she revealed, telling investigators that had discovered my suspicious activities and that's why I'd been terminated. If I didn't fight back with the truth, I could end up taking the fall for his crimes. The decision wasn't really a decision at all. I thought about all the employees at Titan Defense who worked honestly, believing they were serving their country. I thought about the taxpayers being defrauded, the veterans being denied opportunities, and the national security secrets being sold to the highest bidder. I told Agent Morgan I would cooperate fully. She smiled, the first genuine warmth I'd seen from her, and pulled out a tablet to begin taking my statement. But before we could start, my phone buzzed with a text from Maria, my former assistant. It was marked urgent, and what it said made Agent Morgan immediately call for backup. Mariah's message was brief but terrifying. Richard was in the office, ordering the IT department to alter backup servers. He was trying to plant evidence that would show I had been communicating with Chinese technology companies. She was hiding in a supply closet, recording everything on her phone. But she was scared he would destroy evidence that could prove my innocence. Agent Morgan made a single phone call, and within minutes, she received confirmation that agents were entering the Titan Defense building. They caught Richard in the server room, personally overseeing the fabrication of evidence. But the real shock came when they discovered what else had been trying to delete. 18 months of emails between himself and a Russian defense manufacturer, discussing the sale of classified submarine detection technology that could compromise the entire Pacific Fleet. The next 48 hours became a battle for truth in a war of lies. Richard, now out on a $5 million bond, had hired Morrison, Kine, and Associates, the kind of law firm that had partners who golfed with Supreme Court justices and vacationed with senators. Their strategy was as predictable as it was vicious. Destroy my credibility before I could destroy Richard. The character assassination began on a Monday morning. I woke to find my name trending on LinkedIn, but not in a good way. Someone had leaked a story to Defense Industry Daily, claiming it'd been fired from Titan Defense for selling company secrets. The article was carefully crafted, full of unnamed sources and just enough technical detail to sound credible. It mentioned my access to classified systems, my recent financial struggles with my mother's medical bills, and suggested it'd been motivated by desperation. By noon, the story had evolved. Richard held a company-wide meeting, which Maria secretly recorded on her phone. She was sitting in the back row, her phone hidden in her lap, as Richard stood at the podium like a disappointed father addressing wayward children. He spoke about trust, about the sacred duty of protecting national security, about how betrayal from within was the deepest cut of all. Brandon, Richard's nephew, took the microphone next. His performance was remarkably polished for someone who'd been selling overpriced sandwiches from a truck just 3 months earlier. He claimed the executive team had discovered my treasonous activities through routine security monitoring. He showed a PowerPoint presentation with fabricated emails between me and representatives from Chinese technology companies, offering to sell classified specifications for submarine detection systems. The emails looked authentic. They used my writing style, referenced projects I'd worked on, and even included personal details only someone close to me would know. Brandon explained how they'd found encrypted files on my work computer, hidden in folders labeled with innocuous names like vacation photos and recipe collection. He showed what appeared to be security footage of me accessing files after hours, my face clearly visible in the grainy black and white video. What Richard didn't know was that Maria wasn't the only one recording. 6 other employees, people I'd mentored over the years, were quietly documenting everything. They'd seen Richard's pattern of destroying anyone who challenged him, and they weren't going to let it happen again. After the meeting, Maria took an enormous risk. She stayed late, pretending to work on reports, and waited until Richard thought everyone had gone home. Hidden in an adjacent conference room, she recorded Richard explicitly instructing the IT department to plant additional evidence on the backup servers. He was specific about what he wanted: financial transfers that hadn't happened, communication logs that never existed, access records for times when I was provably elsewhere. The head of IT, Dennis, pushed back initially. He pointed out that the digital forensics would show the files had been created after my termination. Richard's response was chilling in its casualness. He said the FBI wouldn't look that closely if the evidence was overwhelming enough, and besides, he had friends in high places who would ensure the investigation stayed surface level. What Richard hadn't counted on was Dennis' conscience. After Richard left, Dennis made copies of everything before following orders. He documented every alteration, every fabrication, every piece of false evidence, creating a parallel record of the frame job as it happened. He was scared for his job, his family's security, but he was more scared of becoming complicit in destroying an innocent person's life. Meanwhile, the public assassination of my character continued. Richard hired a reputation management firm that specialized in destroying whistleblowers. They created fake social media accounts to spread rumors about my mental instability. They posted on industry forums about my alleged gambling debts. Completely fabricated, but detailed enough to seem plausible. They even created a deepfake video that appeared to show me at a casino, when I'd actually been at my mother's bedside in the hospital. The psychological warfare was taking its toll. I stopped leaving my apartment except for meetings with federal investigators. Every time my phone rang, my heart raced, wondering what new lie was being spread. Former colleagues who'd initially reached out in support went silent, probably advised by their lawyers to distance themselves from the scandal. But then Maria arrived at my door on a rainy Thursday evening, carrying a USB drive and looking over her shoulder nervously. She'd been collecting evidence for 3 years, she told me. Ever since Richard had destroyed the career of Jennifer, the previous compliance director who'd asked too many questions. Maria had watched it happen, powerless to help, and had promised herself she'd be ready if Richard tried it again. The USB drive contained a treasure trove of documentation, not just the recent recordings of Richard ordering the frame job, but 3 years of irregular activities. There were emails where Richard explicitly instructed employees to falsify timesheets, recordings of him bragging about overcharging the government, and most damning of all, a video from a company Christmas party where a drunk Richard had boasted about having a federal prosecutor in his pocket. But Maria had saved the best for last. She'd discovered that Richard had been embezzling funds designated for veteran employment programs. The money meant to train and hire former service members had been redirected to shell companies owned by Richard's family members. Over 2 years, more than $8 million intended for veterans had instead paid for Richard's vacation home in Aspen, his wife's jewelry collection, and Brandon's failed business ventures. I immediately forwarded everything to Agent Morgan, who responded within minutes. The FBI was preparing to expand their investigation, she said. And this evidence had just turned a corporate fraud case into something much bigger. Richard wasn't just stealing from the government. He was stealing from veterans, the very people his company claimed to support. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the veterans who'd been denied opportunities because Richard had stolen funds meant for them. I thought about Jennifer, whose career had been destroyed for trying to do the right thing. I thought about all the employees at Titan Defense who came to work every day believing they were serving their country. not knowing their CEO was selling out to the highest bidder. The next morning, my phone rang with a call from Dennis in IT. His voice was panicked as he delivered news that made my blood run cold. Richard had just submitted the fabricated evidence to the FBI, claiming he'd discovered it during an internal investigation. But Dennis had done something extraordinary. He'd embedded a digital watermark in all the fabricated files, a hidden signature that would prove they were created after my termination. It was his insurance policy, he said, and he was willing to testify about everything. The FBI raid on Titan Defense happened at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday. I wasn't there to see it, but Maria sent me updates as federal agents carried box after box of documents out of the building. They seized every computer, every server, every backup drive. Richard's office was stripped bare, its expensive artwork and awards replaced by evidence tags and empty spaces. Richard had arrived at 7:30 in his Bentley, coffee in hand, only to be turned away by federal agents. The image of him standing in the parking lot, screaming at his lawyer over the phone while employees watched from windows above, quickly became the defining moment of his downfall. Someone filmed it, and within hours, it was circulating through defense industry group chats and forums. What Richard didn't realize was that his problems extended far beyond Titan Defense. Over my 5 years as senior compliance director, I'd built relationships with my counterparts at 12 other defense contractors. We had an informal network where we'd discuss best practices, share concerns about regulations, and occasionally vent about difficult executives. When news of my termination and the subsequent investigation broke, they started reaching out. First was Sandra from Apex Systems, who told me that Titan Defense had submitted joint bids with suspicious pricing irregularities. She'd flagged them internally but had been told to process them anyway. Then came Robert from Sterling Defense, who revealed that Richard had approached him about collaborating on a scheme to inflate costs on military housing projects. Robert had declined and documented everything. Within a week, I was receiving messages from compliance officers across the industry. They shared a pattern of Richard's behavior, approaching them with ethically questionable proposals, offering kickbacks for looking the other way, and threatening their careers when they refused. 3 of them had filed reports with the DoD that had mysteriously disappeared from the system. But the most shocking revelation came from an unexpected source. On a Wednesday evening, as I was organizing documents for the FBI, I received a call from an unknown number. The voice was familiar but nervous. Margaret Brennan, Richard's wife of 23 years. Margaret asked if we could meet in person, suggesting a small cafe in a neighborhood where neither of us would be recognized. I agreed, though Agent Morgan insisted on having surveillance nearby for my protection. When I arrived, I barely recognized the polished corporate wife I'd seen at company events. Margaret looked exhausted, her usually perfect appearance replaced by simple clothes and no makeup. She started by apologizing for what Richard had done to me, then revealed why she'd really come. For 5 years, she'd been documenting Richard's illegal activities. It had started when she'd accidentally overheard a phone call about moving money offshore. Her curiosity led her to investigate further, and what she'd found had horrified her. Margaret pulled out a tablet and showed me bank records from accounts in Cyprus, the Cayman Islands, and Switzerland. Over $60 million had been siphoned from Titan Defense and various government contracts. She showed me photographs of Richard meeting with Russian oligarchs at a resort in Montenegro, documents showing he'd sold classified submarine detection technology to foreign agents, and recordings of him discussing plans to flee the country if his schemes were ever discovered. She'd stayed silent for years, she admitted, partly out of fear, and partly because she'd been planning her own exit strategy. But when she learned what Richard had done to me and discovered he'd been stealing from veteran programs, she couldn't remain complicit any longer. Her own father had served in Vietnam, and the thought of Richard stealing money meant for veterans while wearing an American flag pin at every public event made her physically sick. Margaret revealed something else that changed the entire scope of the investigation. Richard had a partner in the government, someone high enough to make investigations disappear and ensure contracts kept flowing to Titan Defense despite irregularities. She didn't know the person's identity, but she had recordings of Richard's side of their conversations, discussing payment schedules and protection services. The most damning evidence was on Richard's private laptop, which Margaret had secretly cloned. It contained correspondence with a Russian defense manufacturer about selling advanced radar technology, negotiations with Chinese firms for classified drone specifications, and detailed plans for establishing a new company in Dubai, where U.S. law couldn't reach him. Margaret wanted immunity in exchange for her cooperation. She admitted to signing documents as a board member without reading them, trusting Richard when he said it was routine business. "She'd been a fool," she said, "but not a criminal." Agent Morgan, who'd been listening to our conversation through the wire I was wearing, texted me that the FBI would likely agree to her terms given the value of her evidence. As Margaret prepared to leave, she said something that stayed with me. She told me that Richard had done this before, at 3 different companies over 15 years. Each time, had destroyed the careers of women who'd challenged him, using his charm and connections to paint them as unstable, incompetent, or corrupt. She gave me a list of names, women whose professional lives had been ruined for trying to do the right thing. That night, I reached out to those women. Jennifer, my predecessor at Titan Defense, now worked as a bookkeeper in a small town in Idaho, her security clearance revoked based on false allegations. Patricia, from his previous company, had spent 2 years fighting legal battles before giving up and leaving the industry entirely. Sarah had attempted suicide after Richard's smear campaign destroyed her reputation and her marriage. Each woman had a similar story. They'd discovered irregularities, reported them through proper channels, and then faced systematic destruction of their careers and personal lives. Richard had refined his tactics over the years, learning how to forge evidence more convincingly, how to manipulate legal systems more effectively, and how to destroy lives more completely. But now, for the first time, his victims were connecting. We formed a group, sharing evidence and testimonies that painted a pattern of criminal behavior spanning 2 decades. The FBI was particularly interested in this pattern, as it suggested Richard's current crimes were part of a long-term criminal enterprise rather than isolated incidents. Dennis, from IT, continued to provide crucial technical evidence. He revealed that Richard had installed sophisticated spyware on company computers to monitor anyone who might challenge him, had been reading my emails for months before firing me, looking for anything he could use against me. When he couldn't find anything, had decided to manufacture evidence instead. The investigation was expanding beyond anything Richard had anticipated. Federal agents were now interviewing employees from his previous companies, examining contracts going back a decade, and tracking financial transactions across dozens of accounts. His carefully constructed empire was collapsing, and the man who'd called me non-essential was about to discover just how essential truth and justice really were. The subpoena arrived on a Monday morning, delivered by a federal marshal who seemed almost apologetic as he handed me the official document. I was to testify before the Senate Armed Services Committee in their investigation of defense contractor fraud. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday, giving me just 3 days to prepare for what would likely be the most important testimony of my life. Agent Morgan arranged for me to work with a team of federal prosecutors to prepare. They coached me on answering questions clearly and concisely, warned me about potential traps the defense might set, and helped me organize the mountain of evidence into a coherent narrative. We practiced for 12 hours each day, with prosecutors playing the roles of hostile senators who might try to discredit me. Richard, meanwhile, was mobilizing his political connections. His lawyer held press conferences suggesting this was a witch hunt, orchestrated by competitors jealous of Titan Defense's success. He appeared on cable news programs, painting himself as a successful businessman being persecuted for his conservative values. He even got Senator James Whitfield, the committee's ranking member from Texas, to publicly question the timing and motivation of the investigation. Thursday morning arrived gray and humid in Washington. I wore my most conservative suit, the navy blue one I'd bought for my mother's church events, and arrived at the Capitol building 2 hours early. The massive marble corridors echoed with footsteps and hushed conversations, the weight of American democracy pressing down from every painted dome and historic portrait. The hearing room was already packed when they escorted me in. Photographers clustered near the entrance, their cameras clicking like mechanical insects as I passed. I recognized faces from the defense industry, journalists I'd seen on television, and in the back row, Margaret Brennan wearing dark sunglasses and a scarf that didn't quite hide her identity. Senator Elizabeth Harrison from Michigan, the committee chair, called the hearing to order. She began by outlining the scope of the investigation: allegations of systematic fraud in defense contracting, compromised classified information, and embezzlement of funds designated for veteran employment programs. Her voice was steady, professional, but I caught the underlying anger when she mentioned the veteran funds. I was sworn in, my hand trembling slightly as I took the oath to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. The microphone seemed impossibly large as I leaned forward to begin my opening statement. I'd memorized it, but the words felt fresh as I spoke about my 5 years at Titan Defense, my commitment to protecting taxpayer dollars and national security, and my decision to report irregularities despite knowing it would likely cost me my career. The first round of questions came from Senator Harrison, who asked me to detail the fraudulent billing practices I'd discovered. I presented spreadsheets showing phantom employees, charts demonstrating inflated costs, and documents proving that veteran hiring numbers had been falsified. The committee's staff displayed these on large screens, making the evidence impossible to ignore. Senator Whitfield interrupted frequently, trying to challenge my credibility. He questioned why I'd waited so long to report problems, suggested I might have been motivated by being passed over for promotion, and implied that my termination had been justified for poor performance. Each attack was carefully crafted to plant doubt without making specific accusations. But I was prepared for this. When he suggested I'd been a disgruntled employee, I calmly presented 5 years of exemplary performance reviews, each one signed by Richard himself. When he questioned the authenticity of my evidence, I explained the digital trail that verified every document. When he implied I might have been involved in the fraud myself, I pointed out that I'd voluntarily submitted to a full FBI investigation and polygraph examination. The turning point came when I revealed the tracking system I'd implemented 3 years earlier. After noticing the first irregularities, I'd quietly embedded invisible digital watermarks in all classified documents I handled. Every file had a unique identifier that logged when it was accessed, by whom, and what was done with it. This system had operated without Richard's knowledge, creating an indisputable record of illegal access and distribution. I showed the committee how Richard's credentials had been used to access files containing submarine detection algorithms on dates when he was supposedly in meetings with board members. I demonstrated how classified documents had been copied to external drives during times when the office was officially closed. Most damning, I showed how these same documents had appeared on servers owned by foreign companies within days of being accessed. Senator Harrison asked about the veteran employment funds, and the room went completely silent as I detailed the embezzlement scheme. $8 million meant for training and hiring veterans had been diverted to shell companies owned by Richard's family members. I showed invoices for training programs that never existed, employment records for veterans who were never hired, and bank records showing the money flowing into Richard's personal accounts. A senator from Arizona, himself a veteran, had to pause several times while questioning me, his anger barely controlled as he reviewed the evidence. He asked if I knew how many veterans could have been helped with that money. I'd done the calculation. Roughly 400 veterans could have received full training and job placement with those funds. 400 men and women who'd served their country had been denied opportunities so Richard could buy vacation homes and jewelry. The most dramatic moment came when I revealed Richard's government accomplice. I couldn't identify the person, but I played a recording Margaret had provided of Richard discussing protection payments with someone he referred to as our friend on the hill. The voice was disguised, but Richard clearly stated that $500,000 would ensure the investigation disappeared. Senator Whitfield suddenly announced he needed to step out for an urgent phone call. He never returned to the hearing. As the hours passed, the committee's attention turned to the broader implications. Senator Harrison asked about industry-wide practices that might enable such fraud. I carefully explained how the complexity of defense contracts, combined with inadequate oversight, and the revolving door between contractors and regulators, created opportunities for exploitation. I presented my recommendations: mandatory rotation of compliance officers between projects, real-time auditing of billing systems, protection for whistleblowers that couldn't be circumvented by termination, and severe personal liability for executives who sign fraudulent reports. The committee members took extensive notes, their staffers furiously typing on laptops. During a break, Agent Morgan informed me that Richard was watching from his lawyer's office. His confident facade was crumbling as senator after senator expressed outrage at the evidence. His biggest supporters were distancing themselves, claiming they barely knew him despite photographs in his office showing them on hunting trips and at political fundraisers together. When the hearing resumed, I dropped the final bombshell. Using Margaret's evidence and the testimony of Richard's previous victims, I showed the committee a pattern of criminal behavior spanning 20 years and 4 companies. This wasn't a single bad actor making poor decisions. This was a serial corporate criminal who'd refined his methods over decades. I presented the names and stories of Jennifer, Patricia, and Sarah, women whose careers Richard had destroyed when they'd tried to expose his crimes. Their testimonies, provided in written form to protect their privacy, showed identical patterns: discovery of fraud, attempts to report it, sophisticated frame jobs, and professional destruction. The committee's counsel noted that this established a pattern of racketeering that could trigger RICO statutes. By the time my testimony concluded after 7 hours, the atmosphere in the room had completely shifted. What had started as a hearing about one company's fraud had become an examination of systemic corruption in defense contracting. 3 more senators announced they were calling for expanded investigations, and the Department of Justice confirmed they were opening additional cases based on the evidence presented. As I left the Capitol building, exhausted but vindicated, I passed Richard's attorney holding an impromptu press conference. He was trying to claim that I was a disgruntled employee seeking attention, but the reporters weren't buying it. One journalist asked directly if Richard would be willing to testify under oath as I had. The attorney's deflection spoke volumes. That evening, as I watched news coverage from my hotel room, I saw Senator Whitfield announce his resignation, citing health concerns and a desire to spend time with family. Within hours, federal agents had raided his offices, finding evidence of what they called significant financial irregularities. Richard's protection on the Hill had just collapsed. Richard Brennan's desperation reached its peak 2 weeks after the congressional hearing. With federal indictments looming and his political protection evaporated, he made one last attempt to destroy me and save himself. It was a move so audacious, so ruthlessly calculated, that even his own lawyers tried to distance themselves from it. The attack began with a carefully orchestrated media blitz. Richard held a press conference at the National Press Club, flanked by a new team of lawyers who specialized in high-profile character assassination cases. He wore a perfectly tailored suit and an American flag pin, his expression mixing wounded dignity with righteous anger as he addressed the gathered media. His claim was as shocking as it was fabricated. According to Richard, we'd been having an affair for 2 years. He painted a picture of a consensual relationship that had gone sour when Head tried to end it, claiming I'd become obsessed and vindictive. He suggested that my whistleblowing was nothing more than a woman scorned, seeking revenge for personal rejection. To support his claims, he produced evidence that made my stomach turn. Text messages filled with intimate details, suggesting late-night meetings and romantic encounters. Photographs that had been digitally manipulated to show us together at restaurants and hotels. Even a video that appeared to show me entering his hotel room during a conference in Las Vegas, though I'd never attended that conference. His lawyers distributed a dossier to media outlets containing these fabrications, along with a narrative that painted me as unstable and manipulative. They claimed I'd pursued Richard relentlessly, that I'd threatened to destroy his marriage if he didn't leave his wife, and that when Head refused, I'd concocted the fraud allegations as revenge. The technology behind the fake evidence was sophisticated. The text messages had been created using advanced spoofing techniques that made them appear in phone company records. The photographs used deepfake technology that was nearly impossible to detect without technical analysis. The video had been created using footage of someone with similar height and build, with my face digitally superimposed. Within hours, the story was everywhere. Cable news programs debated whether a romantic relationship could invalidate whistleblower protections. Social media exploded with discussions about workplace affairs and abuse of power. My photograph appeared next to headlines questioning my motivations and credibility. But Richard had made a critical miscalculation. Had assumed that in the current climate, his word as a powerful man would carry weight against a female whistleblower. Had assumed that the mere suggestion of an affair would be enough to discredit me. Had assumed that other women would remain silent. He was wrong on all counts. Within 24 hours of his press conference, 27 women came forward. They weren't random supporters or distant sympathizers. They were current and former employees of Titan Defense, who'd experienced Richard's harassment firsthand. They formed a united front, holding their own press conference in the same room where Richard had stood the day before. Jennifer, my predecessor whom Richard had destroyed 5 years earlier, flew in from Idaho to stand with us. She revealed that Richard had propositioned her repeatedly, promising career advancement for sexual favors and threatening termination when she refused. She had recordings of his voicemails, increasingly aggressive and explicit, that Shed saved despite his attempts to have them destroyed. Patricia, from his previous company, presented a settlement agreement Shed been forced to sign, with a non-disclosure clause that her lawyer said was now void due to Richard's public statements. She described how Richard had cornered her in his office, how Head touched her inappropriately, and how Head systematically destroyed her career when Shed filed a complaint with Human Resources. Sarah, who'd attempted suicide after Richard's previous smear campaign, appeared via video link from the psychiatric facility where she was still receiving treatment. Her testimony was devastating. She described how Richard had drugged her at a company party, how Shed woken up in his hotel room with no memory of how Shed gotten there, and how Head threatened to release compromising photos if she ever spoke about it. Maria, my former assistant, presented the most damning evidence. Shed been secretly recording Richard for 3 years, ever since Shed witnessed him assault an intern in the supply closet. She had dozens of recordings of Richard making explicit comments, proposing quid pro quo arrangements, and bragging about destroying women who wouldn't comply with his demands. The FBI's technical analysis of Richard's evidence was swift and conclusive. The text messages were fake, created using commercially available spoofing software. The photographs showed clear signs of digital manipulation when examined with forensic tools. The video was a composite of at least 3 different sources, with my face mapped onto another person's body. But the real bombshell came from Brandon, Richard's own nephew. Facing federal charges for his role in the fraud and realizing his uncle would sacrifice him without hesitation, Brandon decided to cooperate fully with prosecutors. He arrived at FBI headquarters with a laptop containing recordings Head made of Richard over the past 3 months. In those recordings, Richard explicitly discussed his plan to frame me. He detailed how he would create the false evidence, how he would disseminate it through friendly media outlets, and how he would use the scandal to negotiate a plea deal that would let him avoid prison. He even laughed about how easy it was to destroy women's careers with suggestions of sexual impropriety. One recording was particularly chilling. Richard discussed his previous victims, referring to them as conquests in a game Head been playing for 20 years. He bragged about the settlement agreements, the non-disclosure clauses, and the fear Head instilled that kept them silent. He mentioned a federal judge who owed him favors and prosecutors Head compromised with blackmail material. Brandon also revealed that Richard had been planning to flee the country. A private jet was scheduled to take him to Dubai in 3 days, where Head arranged for a new identity and access to the millions Head hidden offshore. The only reason he hadn't left already was his narcissistic belief that his final gambit would work and Head emerge victorious. The media narrative shifted dramatically. What had been a story about a possible affair became an exposé on serial sexual predation and corporate corruption. The hashtag #MeToo began trending again, with thousands of women sharing their own experiences of powerful men attempting to destroy them when they spoke truth to power. Richard's remaining supporters abandoned him entirely. His lawyers withdrew from the case, citing irreconcilable differences. His country club revoked his membership. The Defense Industry Association expelled him and issued a statement condemning his actions. Even his wife Margaret publicly declared she was filing for divorce and would cooperate fully with all investigations. Federal prosecutors moved quickly. Richard was arrested at his home at dawn, charged with 43 federal counts including fraud, embezzlement, espionage, obstruction of justice, and now witness intimidation and attempted blackmail. The judge denied bail, considering him a flight risk, and Richard was remanded to federal custody to await trial. As Richard was led away in handcuffs, news cameras capturing every moment, he maintained his arrogance. He shouted that this was a conspiracy, that he was being persecuted, that the truth would come out. But behind his bluster, I saw fear in his eyes. For the first time in his life, Richard Brennan was facing consequences he couldn't buy, threaten, or lie his way out of. The other women and I stood together outside the courthouse, watching as the man who'd tried to destroy us was driven away in a federal transport vehicle. We didn't celebrate. There was no joy in watching someone's complete downfall, even someone who'd caused us so much pain. But there was relief, a sense that justice, long delayed, was finally being served. That evening, I received messages from women across the country who'd been inspired to report their own experiences with corrupt and predatory executives. The Department of Defense announced a comprehensive review of all defense contractors, with new protections for whistleblowers and mandatory reporting of harassment claims. 3 more CEOs resigned suddenly, citing personal reasons, though rumors suggested they were trying to get ahead of their own investigations. The trial of Richard Brennan became one of the most watched corporate corruption cases in recent history. For 6 weeks, prosecutors presented evidence of a criminal enterprise that shocked even seasoned court observers. The conspiracy involved $67 million in fraud, the compromise of classified defense systems, and systematic destruction of anyone who stood in Richard's way. Richard, wearing a federal detention center jumpsuit instead of his expensive suits, sat silently as witness after witness testified against him. His transformation from corporate titan to criminal defendant was complete. The man who'd once commanded boardrooms now sat flanked by federal marshals, his hands occasionally trembling as particularly damning evidence was presented. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They presented financial records showing the full scope of the embezzlement, technical analysis proving the sale of classified information, and testimony from 38 witnesses who'd observed or been victims of Richard's crimes. The digital trail I'd created with my tracking system proved invaluable, providing timestamps and evidence that Richard couldn't refute. Brandon testified for 3 days, detailing every aspect of the fraud he'd witnessed and participated in. He admitted to his own crimes but emphasized that everything had been at Richard's direction. He presented emails, recordings, and documents that showed Richard as the mastermind of a sophisticated criminal operation that had treated national security as a commodity to be sold. Margaret Brennan's testimony was perhaps the most powerful. She appeared composed and articulate as she described 23 years of marriage to a man she'd slowly realized was a monster. She presented evidence of offshore accounts, secret meetings with foreign agents, and Richard's detailed plans to flee the country. When asked why she'd finally come forward, she simply said she couldn't let him steal from veterans while pretending to be a patriot. The defense's case collapsed within days. Richard's attorneys tried to argue that he'd been set up by competitors, that the evidence had been misinterpreted, that he was a successful businessman being persecuted for his wealth, but they couldn't explain the recordings of Richard explicitly discussing his crimes, the digital evidence of classified information being sold, or the testimony of dozens of witnesses with no reason to lie. The jury deliberated for just 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and read guilty verdicts on all 43 counts. Richard's shoulders sagged with each pronouncement, the weight of his crimes finally crushing the arrogance that had sustained him for so long. The judge scheduled sentencing for the following month. warning Richard that he faced the possibility of life in prison. A month later, the courtroom was packed for Richard's sentencing. Victims were given the opportunity to make impact statements, and 14 women stood to describe how Richard's actions had affected their lives. Jennifer spoke about losing her career and having to start over in a small town where nobody knew her shame. Patricia described years of therapy and the inability to trust anyone in authority. Sarah's mother read a statement about finding her daughter after her suicide attempt and the long road to recovery that followed. When it was my turn to speak, I talked not about my own pain but about the 400 veterans who'd been denied opportunities because Richard stole money meant for them. I spoke about the national security implications of his actions, the classified information now in foreign hands, and the breach of trust had created in an industry vital to America's defense. The judge's sentence was severe, but just 35 years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole. Forfeiture of all assets obtained through criminal activity. Lifetime ban from any involvement in government contracting. Personal liability for restitution to all victims. As the sentence was read, Richard finally broke down, sobbing as he realized he would likely die in prison. Brandon received 5 years probation in exchange for his cooperation. He was banned from government contracting and required to perform 2,000 hours of community service at veteran organizations. Margaret Brennan received immunity for her cooperation and used her divorce settlement to establish a foundation supporting women who'd been victims of workplace harassment and retaliation. Titan Defense Solutions declared bankruptcy within weeks of Richard's conviction. The company that had once held contracts worth hundreds of millions was liquidated, its legitimate assets sold to pay creditors and victims. The employees who'd worked honestly found positions with other contractors, many reaching out to thank me for exposing the corruption they'd suspected but couldn't prove. As for me, the vindication was complete but bittersweet. The Department of Defense awarded me the Civilian Service Award for protecting national security and exposing corruption. The award ceremony was small and private, which suited me perfectly. It never sought recognition, only justice and truth. Job offers poured in from defense contractors across the country, all wanting to hire the woman who'd brought down Richard Brennan. But I had a different idea. Using the whistleblower reward I received from the federal government, I established my own compliance consulting firm, specializing in protecting whistleblowers and preventing corporate fraud. My first employee was Maria, whose courage in documenting Richard's crimes had been instrumental in achieving justice. Within 6 months, WED hired 12 more people, including Jennifer and 3 other women Richard had tried to destroy. Our firm, Integrity Shield Consulting, quickly gained a reputation for thorough, uncompromising compliance auditing. Our first major contract came from the Department of Defense itself. They wanted us to audit their top 50 contractors, looking for the kind of irregularities that had allowed Richard to operate for so long. We found problems at 17 companies, though none as severe as what WED uncovered at Titan Defense. Our work led to policy changes that made it harder for corrupt executives to manipulate the system. A year after Richard's sentencing, I stood in my new office overlooking the Potomac River. The walls were covered with letters from veterans who'd been hired through programs funded by recovered stolen money. Compliance officers who'd been inspired to speak up about irregularities, and women who'd found courage to confront their own workplace predators. Dennis from IT now worked as our chief technical officer, developing advanced tracking systems to prevent the kind of fraud Richard had perpetrated. The 27 women who'd stood together against Richard had formed a support network that met monthly, helping each other heal and rebuild. Even Sarah had begun to recover, starting a blog about surviving workplace trauma that had helped thousands. The investigation Richard's case had triggered continued to ripple through the defense industry. 14 more executives had been indicted for various forms of fraud. New legislation called the Whistleblower Protection Enhancement Act had passed with bipartisan support, making it impossible for companies to terminate employees who report irregularities to federal authorities. Senator Whitfield was serving 12 years for corruption, his career and reputation destroyed. The federal judge Richard had mentioned in his recordings had resigned and was under investigation. The network of corruption Richard had been part of was slowly being dismantled, one criminal at a time. Standing in that office, I thought about the morning Richard had called me non-essential. Head meant it as a final insult, a way to diminish my value and justify my termination. But Head been more right than he knew. I wasn't essential to his criminal enterprise. I wasn't essential to maintaining the corrupt status quo. I wasn't essential to the network of lies and fraud Head built. I was essential to something far more important: truth, justice, and the protection of those who serve our country. Every veteran who got a job through recovered funds. Every whistleblower who felt safe coming forward. Every taxpayer dollar saved from fraud. They were all proof that one person standing up to corruption could make a difference. The journey from that morning when security escorted me out with a cardboard box to standing in my own office as CEO of a successful consulting firm had been painful but transformative. I'd learned that integrity isn't just about personal honesty. It's about having the courage to stand against powerful systems of corruption, even when standing alone. Most importantly, I'd learned that being called non-essential by someone like Richard Brennan was actually the highest compliment. It meant I couldn't be bought, couldn't be intimidated, and couldn't be controlled. It meant I was essential to the things that actually mattered: truth, justice, and the protection of those who couldn't protect themselves. My phone buzzed with a text from Agent Morgan, who'd become a friend through this ordeal. She was sending me information about another case, another corrupt executive, thinking he was untouchable. I smiled, knowing that we'd handle this one too. The woman Richard Brennan had deemed non-essential had become essential to something Head never understood: the relentless pursuit of justice. Looking back, I realized that sometimes life's greatest gifts come disguised as its worst moments. Being fired had freed me from a corrupt system and given me the opportunity to help build something better. The path had been brutal, filled with character assassination, legal threats, and moments of deep despair. But it had led to a place where I could make a real difference, where my work had meaning beyond a paycheck, where integrity was the foundation rather than an obstacle. This story, my story, is proof that one person can stand against corruption and win. It's evidence that truth, properly documented and courageously presented, is more powerful than lies backed by money and influence. It's testimony that the women Richard Brennan tried to destroy became the force that destroyed him instead. The woman whose security clearance had held the keys to national security had also held the keys to justice. And unlike Richard, I'd used those keys not for personal gain, but for the protection of everything we claim to value as Americans: truth, justice, and opportunity for those who serve. What would you have done in my position? Would you have stayed silent to keep your job? Or would you have risked everything to expose the truth? Have you ever witnessed corruption or injustice that made you choose between your security and your integrity? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories of courage in the face of corruption. Share this with someone who needs to hear that standing up for what's right, even when it costs everything, is always worth it in the end. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, you're never non-essential when you're standing for the truth.